I want to give you two numbers, and I want you to hold them both in your mind at the same time, because the gap between them is the whole story. Number 1, 8.05 billion naira. That is what Nigeria's 2026 federal budget sets aside for the construction, renovation, and equipping of churches and mosques. 1.91 billion naira for 7 church-related projects, 6.14 billion naira for 52 mosque-related projects. Number 2, 12.8 trillion naira. That is what one single budget line called the service-wide vote now sits at in the same 2026 budget. Last year, that same line was 638 billion naira. In 1 year, it grew by nearly 1,918%. Most of Nigeria is currently arguing about the first number. Atiku Abubakar has publicly demanded Tinubu name every single church and mosque receiving funding. Aisha Yesufu is asking why money that should educate children is going to religious buildings instead. The Northern Christian Elders Forum has rejected the allocation outright, saying security should come first. Every single one of those reactions is legitimate, and we are going to examine all of them properly today. But I want to show you something that almost nobody covering this story has connected yet. While Nigeria argues over 8 billion naira going to churches and mosques, a single unexplained government spending category buried in the same budget has grown by 12.2 trillion naira in 1 year and includes a line item paying out 2.19 trillion naira in what is described only as personnel costs for workers nobody has named. Today on ThePolicyPulseHQ, we are going to walk through both stories properly, the one Nigeria is talking about and the much bigger one hiding right next to it. Stay with me. If you are new to the Policy Pulse HQ, this channel gives you Nigerian political analysis that goes past the headline and into the actual numbers. Subscribe now. Watch the full breakdown here on this channel. This short only gave you half the story. And stay with me, because this video is going to show you a budget scandal bigger than the one Nigeria is currently arguing about.
What was actually allocated and who discovered it? Let us start with the story Nigeria is actually talking about right now and get the facts precisely right before we go any further. The discovery came from Tracka, a Nigerian public accountability organization that specializes in tracking government budget allocations and public spending. According to Tracka's analysis of the 2026 appropriation bill, the federal government earmarked approximately 8.05 billion naira for church and mosque-related projects across the country. Of that total, 1.91 billion naira was allocated to 7 separate church-related projects, and 6.14 billion naira was allocated to 52 separate mosque-related projects. This is not a new or unprecedented category of Nigerian government spending. Religious institution funding through federal and state budgets has appeared in various forms across previous Nigerian administrations. What made this specific allocation generate such significant public reaction is the scale, 8 billion naira in a single budget year, combined with the country's current economic context of widespread poverty, insecurity, and infrastructure deficits. The reactions arrived quickly and from multiple directions. Former Vice President Atiku Abubakar, the ADC's 2027 presidential candidate, issued a formal statement through his senior special assistant on public communication, Frank Shaibu. Atiku said that while faith occupies a sacred place in Nigerian national life, it must never become, in his words, a sanctuary for opaque budgeting or questionable public expenditure. He specifically demanded that the presidency immediately publish the names of every beneficiary institution, every project location, every implementing agency, and the legal basis for each allocation. Aisha Yesufu, a chieftain of the NDC and one of Nigeria's most recognized civic activists, whose recent political journey we have covered extensively on this channel, asked a pointed and direct question. She questioned why money that should be funding education is instead being allocated to religious projects, and asked plainly what business the state has with religion in the first place. The Northern Christian Elders Forum, known as NOSCEF, took perhaps the most striking position, given that Christian institutions are among the direct beneficiaries of this allocation. Through its chairman, Elder Sunday Oibe, the forum formally rejected the allocation, describing it as ill-timed, unnecessary, and inconsistent with Nigeria's pressing national priorities. The forum specifically urged President Tinubu to redirect the funds towards security, economic recovery, and other critical national needs, arguing that Nigerians are currently grappling with insecurity, hunger, poverty, and unemployment at a scale that makes this specific spending priority difficult to justify. Notice what that last reaction tells us. This is not simply an opposition political attack or a religious minority objecting to funding for a different faith's institutions. A Christian elders group is rejecting funding intended in part for Christian institutions because they believe the country's more urgent needs make that spending inappropriate right now. That level of self-sacrifice in the objection is worth sitting with.
Is there actually a legitimate argument for this spending? Before we go further, analytical honesty requires us to examine whether there is a genuine, defensible case for this kind of government spending rather than simply treating it as self-evidently wrong. Nigeria is a deeply religious country, and religious institutions, both Christian and Muslim, provide significant social infrastructure well beyond formal worship. Churches and mosques across Nigeria routinely run schools, health clinics, orphanages, feeding programs, and disaster relief operations, particularly in communities where formal government infrastructure is weak or absent entirely. Government support for religious institutions, in that framing, is not purely about worship. It is indirect support for a parallel social service network that fills genuine gaps in state provision. There is also a political argument, uncomfortable but real, about religious institutions as sites of significant community organization and social cohesion. In a country that has experienced serious religious and ethnic tension, some governments have historically viewed investment in both Christian and Muslim institutions done in a genuinely balanced way as a form of national cohesion spending rather than pure religious patronage. Why the balance argument does not fully resolve the concern being raised, even when we take it seriously. The allocation Tracka identified was split unevenly, 1.91 billion naira for churches versus 6.14 billion naira for mosques, a roughly 1-to-3 ratio. Whether that specific split reflects a genuinely proportionate assessment of need across both religious communities or reflects some other set of priorities entirely is precisely the kind of question that opaque budgeting prevents anyone from answering with confidence. This is exactly Atiku's core demand. Publish the names, the locations, the implementing agencies, and the legal basis. A genuinely defensible program of religious institution support built around real social service provision should be able to survive that level of transparency without difficulty. The fact that this scrutiny is being demanded rather than already provided is itself informative. There is also a separate argument made by the group Alliance for Economic Ethics worth engaging with directly. This organization urged Nigerians to look beyond the controversy over the 8.05 billion naira initial allocation specifically, arguing that the country's worsening overall fiscal imbalance poses a far greater threat to the economy than this single line item. That argument, whatever its intent, leads us directly to the second, much larger number in this story, the one almost nobody discussing the church and mosque allocation has actually examined closely.
Now let us talk about the number that started this entire video, and that deserves to be the headline of this entire controversy, not a footnote inside it. Buried inside Atiku's own statement, reported by Legit.ng,
is a detail that has received almost no independent follow-up coverage. The service-wide vote, a specific budget category within Nigeria's Federal Appropriation Act, ballooned from 638 billion naira in the previous budget year to 12.8 trillion naira in the 2026 Appropriation Act. That is a rise of nearly 1,918% in a single year. Let us be completely precise about the scale of that number, because 12.8 trillion naira is genuinely difficult for any human mind to intuitively grasp. That single budget line is more than 1,500 times larger than the entire 8.05 billion naira church and mosque allocation that has dominated this week's news cycle. If every single naira of public outrage currently directed at the religious project funding were instead redirected toward this service-wide vote line, it would still represent only a tiny fraction of the scrutiny that a 12.8 trillion naira 1,900% increase genuinely warrants. What a service-wide vote is supposed to be, and why this one is different. Here's what you need to understand about what a service-wide vote is actually supposed to contain and why its explosive growth deserves serious institutional scrutiny. In Nigerian federal budgeting, the service-wide vote is traditionally a catch-all category intended for expenditures that cut across multiple ministries, departments, and agencies, things like pension liabilities, contingency reserves, and centrally coordinated obligations that do not belong cleanly to any single ministry's individual budget line. It is by its design one of the least transparent and most difficult to scrutinize categories in the entire federal budget, precisely because it deliberately avoids being tied to any single accountable ministry or agency. That is exactly why a category with those specific characteristics, growing by nearly 1,900% in a single year, should trigger far more institutional alarm than it appears to have generated so far. Atiku specifically demanded the National Assembly launch a line-by-line investigation into these allocations and asked, directly and pointedly, who exactly are the workers earning the 2.19 trillion naira in personnel costs that sits inside this same expanded service-wide vote line? As of this recording, that question has not been publicly answered by the Presidency, the Ministry of Finance, or the Budget Office of the Federation. If you have been following the Policy Pulse HQ, this pattern should feel genuinely familiar to you because it is structurally identical to something we have covered in detail. The PFIPC scandal, the fake presidential agency that operated inside the Federal Secretariat for over a year, also entered Nigeria's national budget through an opaque line item that nobody in government could clearly explain when journalists and opposition figures began asking questions. In that case, the amount involved was measured in the hundreds of millions and eventually over a billion naira. Here, we are looking at a budget category that grew by 12.2 trillion naira in 12 months, sitting inside the same broader 2026 Appropriation Act that also contains the far smaller, far more publicly debated religious project allocation. The pattern in both cases is the same. Money moves through a budget category specifically structured to resist easy public scrutiny, and it only becomes a public issue when an outside accountability organization, in this case Tracka, or in the PFIPC case, independent journalists, does the work that Nigeria's own appropriations oversight process should have already done before the budget was ever signed into law. Drop a comment right now and tell me honestly, should Nigerians be more outraged about the 8 billion naira for churches and mosques or the 12.8 trillion naira service-wide vote explosion that almost nobody is talking about? I want your honest take before we get to what happens next.
Tracing the institutional chain of accountability. Let us be precise about who actually holds responsibility for both of these allocations, because that precision matters enormously for what happens next. Nigeria's federal budget process, in its formal design, is not a document written and imposed by the presidency alone. The executive branch, through the Ministry of Finance, Budget, and National Planning, prepares and submits an initial budget proposal.
The National Assembly, through its appropriations committees in both the Senate and the House of Representatives, is then constitutionally responsible for reviewing, questioning, amending, and ultimately passing that budget into law before it returns to the President for final assent. That means every single line item in the 2026 Appropriation Act, including both the 8.05 billion naira religious projects allocation and the 12.8 trillion naira service-wide vote, pass through the scrutiny or lack of scrutiny of specific named National Assembly committees before becoming law. Nigerians deserve to know which committee chairman and which specific members reviewed and approved these allocations and what questions, if any, they asked before doing so. This is precisely why Atiku's demand for a line-by-line National Assembly investigation is analytically significant beyond its obvious political value to an opposition presidential candidate. It correctly identifies that the National Assembly, not just the presidency, bears direct constitutional responsibility for having passed a budget containing both a controversial, publicly debated religious funding line and a nearly 1900% increase in an opaque, difficult-to-scrutinize catch-all category in the very same document. It is also worth noting the specific figure of 1 billion naira allocated to churches under Deputy Speaker Benjamin Kalu's constituency projects referenced in some of the coverage of this story, which has drawn its own separate wave of criticism. Individual National Assembly members do have discretionary constituency project allocations within the federal budget, and how those individual allocations are used for religious projects, infrastructure, or otherwise represents another layer of this same broader accountability question, distinct from but connected to the executive branch's own religious project spending.
How this budget controversy feeds directly into the 2027 campaign. Let us connect this story to the broader political moment Nigeria is currently in, because this budget controversy is unfolding in the middle of an active presidential campaign season, and that context shapes exactly how it is being used by every political actor involved. Atiku Abubakar is the confirmed ADC presidential candidate heading into January 2027. His response to this budget controversy is not simply the reaction of a concerned citizen. It is a calculated campaign intervention, and there's nothing improper about that. Opposition candidates exist precisely to scrutinize incumbent government spending. But it means his specific framing, using religion to shield questionable public spending, and his specific demand, publish every beneficiary name, are chosen with an eye toward the 2027 electorate, not simply toward abstract fiscal transparency. Aisha Yesufu's intervention carries similar dual weight. As a chieftain of the NDC, Peter Obi's party, her question about education funding being redirected to religious projects fits directly into the broader NDC campaign narrative that we have examined in previous videos on this channel. None of that political context makes either Atiku's or Yesufu's underlying questions illegitimate. Politically motivated scrutiny of government spending is still scrutiny, and in a functioning democracy, opposition figures asking exactly these kinds of pointed questions during a budget controversy is precisely how public accountability is supposed to work. The test is not whether the questioner has a political interest in the answer. The test is whether the questions themselves are valid and whether the government's response actually addresses them with real transparency or simply waits for the news cycle to move on. As of this recording, the presidency has not published the specific list of beneficiary institutions that Atiku demanded and has not provided a specific breakdown or explanation of the service-wide vote's nearly 1900% increase. Whether either of those disclosures happens before the 2027 campaign season intensifies further, or whether this story follows the familiar pattern of Nigerian budget controversies fading from headlines without resolution, is exactly what the next several weeks will reveal.
5 signals for the weeks ahead. Here is exactly what to watch as this budget controversy continues developing. The first signal is whether the presidency or the Ministry of Finance publishes the specific list of beneficiary churches, mosques, project locations, and implementing agencies that Atiku demanded. A full, specific, verifiable disclosure would significantly change how this controversy is understood. Continued silence or a vague, non-specific response would reinforce exactly the opacity concerns being raised. The second signal, and the one I believe deserves the most attention from serious Nigerian political observers, is whether any National Assembly committee or any independent journalist publishes a detailed breakdown of what specifically makes up the 12.8 trillion naira service-wide vote, and a clear explanation for its nearly 1900% single-year increase. This is the number that should be generating sustained investigative attention, not a single day's worth of coverage buried inside a story about religious funding. The third signal is whether the 2.19 trillion naira in unexplained personnel costs within that same expanded line receives any specific accounting. Who these workers are, which agencies they belong to, and what specific roles justify that scale of spending are exactly the kind of concrete, verifiable facts that would move this story from suspicion to either vindication or genuine scandal. The fourth signal is whether NOSCEF's specific request, redirecting religious project funds towards security and economic recovery, instead receives any formal government response. A rejection by religious leaders themselves of funding intended in part for their own institutions is a genuinely unusual political development that deserves a substantive government answer, not silence. The fifth signal is whether this story, like so many Nigerian budget controversies before it, fades from public attention within days as a new news cycle begins, or whether sustained pressure from Atiku, civil society, and channels willing to keep asking these questions keeps both the 8 billion naira allocation and the 12.8 trillion naira service-wide vote in public view until Nigerians actually get the answers they have been promised.
Here is where this story leaves us. Nigeria is right now having a genuinely important public conversation about 8.05 billion naira allocated to churches and mosques in a country facing serious poverty, insecurity, and infrastructure deficits. That conversation deserves to happen, and the questions being asked about transparency, proportion, and priority are entirely legitimate. But sitting quietly beside that 8 billion naira line in the very same budget document is a 12.8 trillion naira category that grew by nearly 1900% in a single year, containing over 2 trillion naira in personnel costs nobody has publicly explained. That number is more than 1,500 times larger than the one currently dominating Nigerian headlines, and it has received a tiny fraction of the scrutiny. Nigerians deserve answers to both questions, not one instead of the other. Both. And until the National Assembly, the Ministry of Finance, or the Presidency provides those answers with real, verifiable specificity, every Nigerian watching this video has the right to keep asking, loudly and repeatedly, exactly where that money is actually going. If this analysis showed you something about this budget you had not seen before, share it with one Nigerian who needs the fuller picture, not just the religious funding headline. Like this video, subscribe to ThePolicyPulseHQ, and tell me in the comments which number deserves more outrage, the 8 billion for churches and mosques or the 12.8 trillion service-wide vote explosion. I will see you in the next one.